The regime has succeeded as of now in maintaining the minimum key elements required for its survival, very much against predictions, as you will all remember, the predictions in the course of 2011 and 2012, in which the rebels and their many advocates and supporters were constantly predicting the imminent demise of the Assad regime. And yet, these predictions notwithstanding, the political circle around the president, around Bashar al-Assad, has seen no major defections since the start of the uprising. No one from the inner circle, no central army chiefs have gone over to the rebels, even during the darkest days of the regime in late 2012. This is a deeply notable fact. And now, of course, that the regime appears nowhere near to collapse, such defections are far less likely. The economy, too, has survived, again, contrary to many of the predictions in the course of 2011 and 2012, largely as a result of the very large donations from the Islamic Republic of Iran and the very large credit line afforded by the Iranians to keep their ally in place. The Syrian Arab Army, the official name for the army of Assad, which notionally numbers 220,000 troops in 12 divisions, plus an additional 280,000 reservists, has of course hemorrhaged troops since the start of the uprising. But the regime doesn't need the entirety of this force in order to defend itself. It has a number of key, reliable forces: the Republican Guard, the 4th Armoured Division, which people will perhaps be familiar with, the Special Forces. All of these are overwhelmingly Alawi in terms of their ethnic nature, and these can be relied upon. And in addition, the regime has maintained throughout a force of an estimated 60 to 70,000 armed Alawi irregulars, known initially as the Shabika. People who look at Syria closely will remember this strange term, originally used to refer to Alawi criminal smugglers, which then became used in the course of the war to refer to these irregulars. And crucially and fascinatingly, in the course of 2013, the Iranians and Hezbollah utilized this irregular force, turned it from an irregular force into a semi-regular force called the National Defense Forces, the better to adopt to solve the crucial shortage of manpower, which I referred to earlier as being the regime's central Achilles heel. So there are today now around 50,000 fighters of this National Defense Forces engaged on behalf of the Assad regime. There are also around, we think, 10,000 Hezbollah fighters in the country at any given time engaging on behalf of the regime. And there are around 6,000 to 7,000 other militiamen from various pro-Iranian militias throughout the region, notably from Iraq. Organizations such as Ahl al-Haq, Kataib, Hezbollah, and a number of others which people will know about, who follow this stuff closely. The country has 4 security directorates also: military intelligence, air force intelligence, state security and political security, with around 65,000 workers, and these also are engaged on behalf of the regime. In terms of its domestic standing, the regime maintains the loyalty of the 12% Alawi minority, and the 10% Christian minority also, to a great extent, has remained with the regime, increasingly frightened at the appearance taken on by the rebellion in the course of the last 3 years of an increasingly Sunni Islamist outlook. So the Assad regime is stretched, but it shows no signs of imminent collapse. It has probably passed its lowest point in the course of the last 3 years. Its main problem remains a shortage of manpower, and we see how this still works out. And those of you who follow Syria closely will know that the regime and its spokespeople, for example, have been predicting now for the last year that the regime is about to complete the encirclement of Aleppo city and is about to take the second city of the country back from the rebels, but it's always about to do it. It never seems to quite get round to doing it. And the key reason for this is because it has not sufficient forces to risk moving a massive army up to Aleppo. It needs to keep its forces still spread out. Thus far, then, with regard to the Assad regime, a regime which was in trouble, which took drastic measures to survive by reducing the area it needed to control, and which is now effectively out of trouble. With regard to the rebellion, the Sunni rebels, this rebellion has been, if the Assad regime's Achilles heel throughout has been a shortage of manpower, the problem for this rebellion throughout has been an inability to unite. It has never managed to unite into a single fighting force. As of now, the rebels are in control, or remain in control, of a section of Idlib and Aleppo provinces in the north and northwest of Syria, a section of Daraa province in the south, and the entirety of Quneitra province adjoining the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights. But there's still not a single rebellion, a single rebel organization. The Free Syrian Army, which we all, a very ringing term, which we were all once very familiar from our news screens, today means very little. It's a website, or it's a term that one uses as a kind of generic term. But the most important force within the non-ISIS rebels today is Jabhat al-Nusra. And Jabhat al-Nusra, which people will know here, is the Syrian franchise of the Al-Qaeda organization. Jabhat al-Nusra, established in January 2012, led by a man called Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, about whom very little remains known, is thought to have around 15,000 fighters. It's established itself as the most capable and able of the myriad forces engaged under the banner of the rebellion. I can go into greater detail in question time about this if people are interested, but the rebellion, many of the forces originally engaged under the name of the rebellion are today largely engaged in business on behalf of their leadership. There are many men who have enriched themselves personally, coming from very humble backgrounds as a result of their engagement with the rebellion. And these guys, having acquired a lot of money and power from the rebellion, you won't be surprised to hear, are less keen nowadays on engaging against Assad's forces, more keen on enjoying the fruits of their labours. With the result that the rebellion is mired in corruption, and the result that a serious force like Jabhat al-Nusra can now take great advantage of other rebel forces, often challenging them, often driving them from their areas of exclusive control. The third part of this picture, and the one which perhaps you're most interested in, although probably you can tell from this lecture that a large lesson I'm trying to suggest here is that we shouldn't be most interested in necessarily in the Islamic State, because it's only one component, but the Islamic State, which now controls, of course, a large section of western Iraq, eastern Syria, up to Deir ez-Zor province, then up towards Aleppo province, originated as an organization called Jama'at al-Tawhid wa al-Jihad in 1999 in Iraq, and was then renamed Tanzim Qaidat al-Jihad fi Bilad al-Rafiqain, also commonly known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in 2004. Of course, famously, this organization in Iraq took part in the Sunni insurgency in 2005 and 2006, and became known and famous in that context for its suicide attacks, for its violent methods, and for the widespread killing of prisoners. All these practices, which have since become, of course, widely known under the banner of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, were there already 5, 6, and 7 years ago. People who were looking at Iraq closely were very much aware of them. And they led, indeed, at that time also to a backlash in areas controlled by Islamic State in Iraq, in Anbar province, in Ramadi. People will be familiar with these areas, from Iraqi civilians, and from, indeed, from other armed groups. This enabled, of course, the American surge to be a relative success. Many of us thought that the Islamic State in Iraq was something of a busted flush. That's to say, we thought, okay, it had its moment in the high days of the Sunni insurgency in Iraq. The American surge had depleted it very seriously, and that, we thought, would be the last we would necessarily hear of it. That probably would have been the case were it not for the outbreak of civil war in Syria and the attempt by the nucleus of the Islamic State in Iraq to insert itself into the Syrian context. And we note, of course, from April 2013, the emergence of the group calling itself the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, under the leadership of one Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, ISIS or ISIL, moving into eastern Syria, the eastern Syrian theatre of conflict, establishing itself in Raqqa, in Idlib, in Deir ez-Zor, in Aleppo, and then in February 2014, entering into a kind of power struggle within Al-Qaeda between itself and Jabhat al-Nusra, leading Al-Qaeda to cut all ties with the group at that time, citing its failure to consult with the leadership of Al-Qaeda and I quote, its notorious intransigence, close quote. it is an interesting thing, without wishing to inject too much humour into this obviously very serious discussion, that an organisation which can be accused by Ayman al-Zawahiri of notorious intransigence is probably a movement which we should take a great deal, we should approach with a certain degree of seriousness or caution, let us say. The group's original aim was to establish an Islamic state in Sunni majority regions of Iraq, hence its name. And once it joined the Syrian civil war, what it effectively did was to transfer this ambition from Syria over to, from Iraq over to Syria. And famously, on 29th June of this year, this Islamic State in Iraq and Syria proclaimed the areas under its control in Raqqa province and Deir ez-Zor to constitute the beginning of a worldwide caliphate. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, henceforth to be known as Amir al-Mu'minin, the head of the believers, or Caliph Ibrahim, as he's now officially known, from then on known as the head of the Islamic State. This state then claimed religious authority over all Muslims worldwide. Now, this, of course, has led to a great deal of publicity. You know, we should be aware, without wishing to belittle the Islamic State, heaven forbid, that there is a certain element of absurdity in all this. You know, this is a small entity, or relatively small territorial entity, precariously controlled by this terrorist organisation, which is trying hard to establish an authority and administration of it with a certain amount of success. But the idea that you know, its ambition to bring all Muslim inhabited regions of the world under its control in the immediate or near future, beginning with Iraq and the Levant region, you know, deserves to be taken, I think, with a certain degree of skepticism. Having said that, a number of other groups throughout the region have begun, indeed, to declare loyalty to this putative state, including notably groups in eastern Libya, and also specifically and interestingly, for our Israeli point of view at least, a group called Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis in northern Sinai. Thus far then, with regard to the entity established by Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, let me just briefly note the fourth entity, which I mentioned as coming into being as a result of the de facto partition of Syria, namely the area controlled by the Syrian Kurds, specifically by the Syrian franchise of the PKK organisation, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, a registered terrorist organisation in both European Union and in the United States, very possibly also here in New Zealand, for all I know. This organisation, or these areas, interestingly or fascinatingly, have emerged as the most peaceful and probably the best administered of any parts of Syria. And I've spent a certain amount of time in each of them reporting over the course of the last year, and it's very interesting to note what has been established there. Of course, ISIS now currently, or Islamic State now currently, in the midst of an attempt to destroy the central one of these enclaves, the famous or now well-known Kobani enclave in northern Syria. So, in terms of the latest developments then, we have a civil war which led to a de facto partition of the country, the emergence of 4 new enclaves in that country, 4 would-be successor entities, so to speak, to the Assad regime and the government of Syria, and then internecine war between all 4 of these enclaves. And in the course of this summer, in the course of summer of 2014, this situation, this war has burst its banks, has burst its borders, so to speak, out of the corpse, if I can put it that way, of Syria and into the neighbouring countries. And the process, of course, which began that was in June with the launching by Islamic State of an unexpected and devastatingly effective, in the initial stages, offensive into Iraq, rapidly capturing, of course, the city of Mosul, and leading to panic in Jordan and Saudi Arabia, who moved troops to their borders with Iraq, and leading to the loss of a number of key crossing points, and leading to genuine speculation as to the possibility of the Islamic State pushing towards the capital city of Baghdad. On the 3rd of August 2014, in a second phase of the offensive, the Islamic State captured the towns of Zumar, Sinjar, and Wana in northern Iraq. And it's at this point that we see the beginnings of potential humanitarian catastrophe as a result of the ISIS push into Iraq, as civilians